Hello everyone, this is Father Hayes, and I've been asked to do a video on marriage and the Eucharist. And so what I was thinking about doing is a little bit of a reflection for you on some of the scriptural points that will hopefully tie together for you to give you something to help you with your prayer and your meditation and your discussion among each other. So when we're talking about marriage, or really relationship in general, the first thing we want to always anchor ourselves with is that fundamental point that we are created for relationship. And of course, the relationship between spouses is one of those pinnacle relationships. But we are created for relationship by the one who is relationship, is the origin and perfection of relationship. And so all of our relationships are intended to be a reflection of this deeper, greater reality of God Himself, God revealing Himself to us. And also those relationships we have in our life, and in a very particular way, the relationship of husband and wife, are intended to be icons pointing us to the relationship of the three divine persons in the Trinity, and also that relationship of the second person who is incarnate God to us, the bridegroom, and his relationship with his bride, the church. And so let's try to unpack this a little bit. So we look at the two creation accounts, right? How God brought about everything that's around us, right? We begin Genesis with, in the beginning, God created, right? He brought into existence everything out of nothing. And so we have two creation accounts. Then we're familiar with each one, but maybe we haven't really thought to separate the two. So the first creation account is the one we're familiar with of the 7 days of creation. God is systematically creating. He's creating the environments, and then He's filling those environments with life. And so on the sixth day, He culminates all that creation with the creation. He says, let us make man in our image, male and female He made them. And then He said, gave the command to humanity to be fruitful and to multiply. And then on the seventh day, God rested. So in this first creation account, we see the creation of man and woman as the pinnacle of that creation, that process of creation. And then we have this mysterious reference to God resting on the seventh day. Now, John Paul II, in his reflection on the Sabbath rest, a document called Deus Domini, the Day of the Lord, he talks about the Sabbath rest. And he says, God is not like us. God doesn't get physically tired, so He didn't need to rest. So the rest that we're talking about in Scripture is something different than when you and I just need to take a break after a long day's work, or take a break in the middle of a project. And so what the Pope says is God is looking on His creation. If you go back and you look at those latter 3 days, day 4, 5, and 6, as God is filling His creation with life. He says it's good, it's good, it's good. And then when He gets to that pinnacle of man and woman, He says it's very good. So the Pope says that resting on the seventh day is really something more of a nuptial gaze, a gaze looking at the goodness of His creation. And so the Pope says right there in the very beginning, in that first creation story, we have this nuptial theme that will run all the way through the Scripture. Now, John the Evangelist in his Gospel takes these images from Genesis and he builds on them. And so if you go and you look at the beginning of John's Gospel, of course, the beginning of John's Gospel begins with, in the beginning. So right there's a clue that John is pointing his audience back to Genesis. He's using Genesis imagery as an overlay for us. And so if you look at the beginning of John's Gospel, you'll notice very subtly that he's counting down 7 days. And the seventh day is the wedding feast at Cana. Now, and a couple interesting things that he does there. First, it's in the wedding feast at Cana, which is only in John's Gospel. It's one of only 2 times in John's Gospel where Jesus refers to Mary as woman. So a lot of people mistake that and think that's a very disrespectful way of speaking to his mother. But what John's doing is he's pointing us back to Genesis imagery. And so what does Jesus do at that wedding feast? He changes water into wine. And there's so many layers of meaning in this story, and so many spiritual writers have written so beautifully on it. But one of the things I want to talk about is he's changing one thing, changing in its substance and its nature into something else and something better. And that is prefiguring for us that God is going to change our nature into his nature. He becomes human, he shares our humanity, so that in turn we can share his divinity and participate in that first and original relationship of the three divine persons in the Trinity. Okay, so right there we have something to kind of build our reflection on. So let's go then to the second creation account. Because the question we have to ask is, how does God change our nature? And the answer is going to be the Eucharist, where he gives himself to us through the Eucharist. So in the second creation account, whereas the first creation account, the creation of man and woman, is the high point, the culmination of this creation activity. In the second creation account, it's the centerpiece. So God begins by forming man out of the dust of the earth and blowing the breath of life into him, right? Blowing into his nostrils. And so what we see there is how the uniqueness of our human nature, that we are part of the material creation and part of the spiritual creation. We are body and soul. And then what does God say? He puts him in the garden. He says, it's not good for man to be alone. So again, that theme of relationship, right? We are created for relationship because the one who has created us is relationship. Okay? So he says it's not good for man to be alone. And he puts them into the garden, and then he brings the animals in. Right? So it's a little bit of a reverse from the first creation account. What does man do? He names the animals. Right? Well, we could look at that and say, okay, well, that just shows that humanity has kind of an authority over the rest of creation, which is true. But again, Pope John Paul II, in his theology of the body, says there's something else going on. Because he's saying that Adam is self-aware. When he's naming the animals, he knows, right? Because remember, the purpose of the animals is so that man is not alone, so that he has one to be in relationship with. But Adam knows he's different than the animals. So, God puts him into a deep sleep. And from his side, he takes the rib and he forms woman. And then when Adam awakes, he says, finally, one who's bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And then right after that, the creation account says, it is for this reason that a man will leave his father and his mother and cling to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So here we have this interesting dynamic of the two becoming one. And so what we see in this, again, is this fulfillment of our purpose for existing, which is relationship, right? But we know through the teaching of the church and God's revelation that ultimately human relationships, as beautiful as they are, particularly that relationship of husband and wife, and as parents bringing new life into the world, there's still something we yearn for, right? And that points us, again, that our ultimate destiny is to be sharing the relationship of the Trinity. So how does God bring that about? He becomes one of us in order to give us access to the divine nature, and he does that by giving himself to us. So again, John the Evangelist comes in and he's using this Genesis imagery in his gospel accounts. So the second time that he refers to Mary as woman is at the foot of the cross. Now, the other interesting little point on this is that only in John's gospel is Mary at the foot of the cross. And only in John's gospel do we have the account of Jesus having his side pierced by the centurion. And what flows out of his side? So we have the crucifix behind us. We have, of course, the tabernacle with the Eucharist. What flows out from there? Blood and water. And the church sees that as the image, first of the birth of the church, the birth of the bridegroom's bride, but also it sees the sacraments. Baptism, which is that initiation sacrament, and Eucharist. Pope John Paul the Great has always said, though, even though baptism is the first sacrament in the sense of the sacramental life, it's the doorway into the sacramental life, the primordial sacrament, the one from the very beginning, is marriage. And so what we see with Christ on the cross is this nuptial imagery. And we see John using that imagery to direct us back to that second creation account, where the two will ultimately become one flesh. So I hope this has given you some points to meditate on. Remember, we're dealing with mystery, we're dealing with a reality bigger than our ability to fully understand it. But God is giving us reference points to help us go deeper. So I hope that this little video can help you go deeper in seeing your relationship as husband and wife, the mystery that's wrapped around that, what God is pointing to in terms of your identity one to another, but also that you are both icons pointing each other to that perfect relationship, that original relationship, which is the relationship of the three divine persons, and how divinity is reaching out to humanity as the bridegroom reaches out to his bride. May God be with you.